I'm so glad you're here. My name is Eleanor, and for 45 years I dedicated my life to being a loving wife and mother. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe, because you are about to hear a story of how a mother's grief was twisted into a cold-blooded plan for revenge. After my husband passed away, I thought my son and his new wife would be my comfort. Instead, while I was setting the table for our family dinner, I overheard them whisper. They were plotting to hire someone to kidnap me, just to get their hands on the inheritance. They thought I was a weak, grieving widow who would be easy to discard. They had no idea I recorded every single word. I want to know how far my story of justice has reached, so please tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The first Sunday dinner after my husband Richard's passing was meant to be a quiet affair, a gathering of the three of us to find comfort in our shared grief. But the only thing I found in the strained silence was the chilling realization that I was now an obstacle. The stately Charleston house, usually filled with Richard's booming laughter and the warm scent of his pipe tobacco, felt cavernous and cold. The air, heavy with the funereal perfume of old roses from the garden, seemed to cling to the heavy drapery, muffling the familiar sounds of home until all that was left was the loud ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that now felt less like a heartbeat and more like a countdown. I had spent the afternoon preparing Richard's favorite meal, a roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, hoping the familiar aroma would feel like a hug, a small anchor of normalcy in the storm of our loss. But as Leo and Chloe sat across from me at the polished mahogany table, their plates barely touched, the food grew cold. Leo, my son, couldn't meet my gaze. He stared intently at his silverware, his jaw tight, a restless energy radiating from him that felt more like guilt than grief. Chloe, his wife, was a master of false sympathy. She reached across the table to pat my hand, her touch cool and fleeting, her eyes assessing me with a clinical precision that belied her gentle words. "You're being so brave, Eleanor," she murmured, her voice a soft purr. "But you mustn't carry this all on your own. This house, it's an enormous responsibility for one person." There it was, the first shot fired under the guise of compassion. "This house is my home, Chloe," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "It holds 45 years of my life." "Of course," she conceded smoothly, "but Dad would have wanted you to simplify your life now, to be unburdened." Leo, as if on cue, cleared his throat. "Chloe's right, Mom," he said, finally looking up, his eyes filled with a pained discomfort. "We were thinking we could help you sort through Dad's financials. You know you never had to worry about that stuff. It would take the burden off you." His words were meant to sound caring, but they landed like an insult, a stark reminder that they saw me as the helpless wife, naive to the complexities of the fortune Richard had built. It was true. Richard had handled the investments, but he had discussed every decision with me. They didn't know that. They saw a grieving widow, not a lifelong partner. I offered a small, tight smile, gently rebuffing their offer. "That's very thoughtful of you both, but I am perfectly capable of managing things for now. Your father and I discussed our plans for years." Chloe's smile tightened, just for a second, a flicker of irritation that she quickly masked. The carefully constructed facade of the concerned daughter-in-law had cracked. As I stood to clear the plates, I glanced into the study, my gaze falling on the large oil portrait of Richard above the fireplace. I remembered his last piece of advice to me, given just a few months before his final illness. We were discussing a business rival's family, and he'd said, "Eleanor, if they ever push you, remember you're stronger than they think." I didn't understand the specific warning then, but in the growing chill of my dining room, it felt like a prophecy. As dinner concluded, Chloe dabbed her lips with a napkin and delivered her parting shot with a helpful, almost cheerful tone. "We should really get the estate settled quickly," she said, looking pointedly at me. "You never know what could happen." The veiled threat hung in the air, a poison dart wrapped in a silk ribbon. As they finally prepared to leave, I walked them to the door. Leo gave me a perfunctory hug, his body stiff and distant. As they walked down the stone path to their car, the porch light illuminated them in the growing dusk. I was about to close the door when I overheard Chloe's low, venomous whisper carry back to me on the humid evening air. "She's going to be more stubborn than I thought," she hissed to Leo. "We need to escalate." They came back a week later, not with casserole dishes and condolences, but with glossy brochures for assisted living facilities that looked more like prisons for the forgotten. Chloe's whispered promise to escalate had manifested as a full frontal assault on my life, packaged in the cheerful clinical branding of Golden Years Senior Living. They spread the brochures across my coffee table, the vibrant photos of smiling, white-haired strangers playing bocce ball, a grotesque violation of the quiet, sunlit living room. Each page was a calculated insult, a declaration that my time in this house, my home, was over. "We've been doing some research, Eleanor," Chloe began, her voice adopting a tone of firm, logical persuasion that was far more chilling than her fake sympathy. "For your safety and peace of mind. These places have 24-hour nursing staff, prepared meals, and social activities. It's the practical, responsible choice." Leo, now a confident parrot for his wife's talking points, chimed in. "It's about being proactive, Mom. We can't risk you being here all alone. The house is too big. The stairs are a hazard. It's a constant worry for us." I looked at them, my grief solidifying into a cold, defensive anger. I thought of a promise I had made to Richard years ago when we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. He had been talking about a friend who'd sold his family home, and he'd taken my hand. "This house is our story, Eleanor," he'd said. "Don't ever let them turn it into just another asset." I now realized that to my children, our story was just a book they were eager to close, its final chapter to be written in a sterile, one-bedroom apartment with a view of a parking lot. "I am not leaving my home," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "This is where your father and I built our life. Every corner, every scuff on the floor holds a memory. It is not for sale." Chloe's mask of patience began to crack. She exchanged a look with Leo. A silent command. "Mom," Leo said, his tone shifting, "we have to be realistic. You've been forgetful lately." I stared at him, my heart turning to ice. "Forgetful?" "You forgot about your doctor's appointment on Tuesday," Chloe supplied smoothly. "And you couldn't find your car keys for an hour yesterday. We had to help you look for them." Both were lies, but they were clever ones. I had rescheduled my appointment, and my keys had been in my purse, exactly where I always kept them. They were inventing small incidents, twisting reality to build a case that I was a danger to myself, that my mind was failing. This was the gaslighting, the psychological abuse designed to make me question my own sanity. The climax of their attack was delivered by my own son. He leaned forward, his face a mask of feigned, earnest concern. "Mom, Chloe is right," he said, his voice dropping as if sharing a terrible secret. "We saw you left the back door unlocked last night. We came by to check on you, and it was wide open. What if someone had gotten in? We have to do what's best for you, even if you don't see it." The lie was so audacious, so cruel, that it left me breathless. I had been a stickler for locking doors my entire life. After they left, the brochures still littering my coffee table like a monument to their betrayal, I walked on trembling legs to the back of the house. I checked the deadbolt on the back door. I distinctly remembered the familiar, satisfying click of it locking the night before. I realized then, with a jolt of ice in my veins, that they were not just suggesting. They were fabricating evidence, willing to lie, to cheat, to dismantle my reality piece by piece until I had no choice but to surrender. The escalation she had promised was here, and it was far more insidious than I could have ever imagined. The dinner was supposed to honor the memory of my 45-year marriage to Richard. Instead, my children used it as a public stage to put my sanity on trial. After their last visit, where they had brazenly fabricated a story about the unlocked door, a week of tense silence had followed. Then came Chloe's call, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, suggesting we have a small dinner to mark what would have been my anniversary. "Just us, and I've invited your Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim," she'd said. "I know how much you need family around you right now." At the time, I'd naively hoped it was a peace offering. Now, as I looked across the dining room table at my sisters' and brother-in-law's uncomfortable faces, I understood. This wasn't for family support. It was to have witnesses for my decline. The atmosphere in the house was thick with fake sentiment. I had used our best china, the plates we'd received as a wedding gift, and placed a single white rose in a crystal vase at the center of the table, Richard's favorite. But the simmering tension from Leo and Chloe made the air feel suffocating. Carol and Jim, bless their hearts, tried to fill the silence with small talk, but even they could feel the undercurrent of a battle being waged. The first move came during the toast. Leo stood, his wine glass held high, and began with a passable tribute to his father. But then his focus shifted to me, his voice taking on a patronizing, pitying tone for the benefit of his audience. "And to Mom," he said, "for being so strong through all this. We know it's been a struggle for her, keeping up with everything. It's why we're so committed to supporting her in her golden years, to make sure she's safe and cared for." The words were a public declaration of my supposed fragility. Before I could respond, Chloe placed a thick manila folder on the table beside my plate. "Speaking of which," she said, her smile perfectly practiced, "we brought a little anniversary gift for you, Eleanor, a gift of peace of mind." She opened the folder to reveal the same power of attorney documents from before. In front of my sister and her husband, she presented this legal ambush as a loving gesture. "This just allows Leo to handle the stressful things, the estate, the bills," she explained to Carol and Jim. "It's what Richard would have wanted, for her to be free of all that worry." I stared at the papers, then at my daughter-in-law, my blood running cold. This was a public shaming, designed to make any refusal on my part seem irrational and ungrateful. I gently pushed the folder back toward the center of the table. "That won't be necessary," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Chloe's performance was instantaneous. Her face crumpled, and her eyes filled with crocodile tears. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, her voice breaking dramatically. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult. We are only trying to help you. Can't you see how ungrateful this makes you look?" Carol and Jim shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes darting between us, caught in the crossfire of a drama they didn't understand. It was then that Leo, emboldened by his wife's theatrical display, delivered the final devastating blow. He stood up, his voice ringing with a false, righteous indignation. "See?" he said loudly, gesturing at me as if I were a misbehaving child. "This is what we mean. She's not thinking clearly. She's pushing away the people who love her." He looked from Carol to Jim, then back at me, his eyes hard. "We may have no choice but to ask the court to intervene." The threat, now made public, hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The rest of the dinner was a disaster. After it finally ended and my relatives had made their awkward, hasty exit, I retreated to the kitchen to clear my head, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. The dining room door was slightly ajar, and as I stood by the sink, I heard Leo and Chloe in the hallway, their voices no longer performing but low and venomous. I froze, realizing I needed to know what they were plotting next. While setting the table for the following Sunday's dinner, pretending everything was normal, I heard my son and his bride whisper the words that would seal their fate: hire someone to kidnap her. The week since the disastrous anniversary dinner had been a masterclass in psychological warfare. They treated me with a cloying, suffocating kindness, a transparent attempt to feign concern while they plotted their next move. I, in turn, played my part, the grieving widow still too shocked by their intervention to argue. But beneath my placid surface, a cold, watchful anger was beginning to take root. That Sunday, the late afternoon sun streamed through the dining room windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood. The scene was deceptively peaceful as I methodically set out the family china, the familiar weight of each plate a small comfort. Leo and Chloe were in the adjoining study, the heavy oak door left slightly ajar. Believing I was lost in my duties, out of earshot. It was their arrogance, their utter dismissal of me as a person of consequence, that would be their undoing. I was placing the silverware when their low, conspiratorial voices drifted into the room. I froze, a silver fork clutched in my hand. The lawyer said the wandering angle is the strongest. Chloe's voice hissed, a venomous whisper. If she's found miles from home, disoriented, no judge in the state would deny an emergency evaluation. My blood ran cold. I remembered Leo's threat of asking the court to intervene, but this was something far more sinister. I now understood they've moved from legal threats to criminal conspiracy. They weren't just going to lie about me, they were going to create the evidence themselves. How would we even do that? Leo asked, his voice laced with a pathetic, weak-willed anxiety. We don't, Chloe snapped back, her impatience sharp. We hire someone, a professional, someone who can make it look convincing. They pick her up, drive her out to the middle of nowhere, and drop her off. We call the police, frantic with worry. It's perfect. My hands were trembling so violently I had to set the fork down before I dropped it. My first instinct was to burst in, to confront them, to scream. But a deeper, colder instinct took over. They had declared war. And in war, you do not reveal your intelligence to the enemy. Outwardly calm, but inwardly a storm of ice and fire, I discreetly took my smartphone from my apron pocket. With trembling fingers, I opened the voice recording app and pressed the red button. Making it look as though I was adjusting the floral centerpiece, I slid the phone behind a large crystal vase on the sideboard just outside the study door, its tiny microphone pointed directly at the source of the poison. I continued setting the table, my movements a mask for the roaring in my ears. As I listened to them finalize the details of my destruction, they discussed how to drug my tea to make me more compliant, how to brief the professional to ensure I seemed genuinely confused when found. Then, I captured the most damning part of the conversation on the recording, the words that I knew would be their end. It was Chloe, her voice filled with a chilling, triumphant certainty. It's foolproof, Leo. They find her disoriented miles from home. The doctors declare her a danger to herself, and we get control before she can fight back. It's clean. I let the recording run for another 30 seconds before I discreetly retrieved my phone and stopped it. I stood there for a long moment, the heavy silence of the dining room pressing in on me, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had them. Now I just had to figure out how to build the perfect cage for the monsters my son and his wife had become. The first step in my war was to become a ghost, to play the part of the fading, forgetful woman they so desperately wanted me to be. With the chilling recording of their conspiracy saved and secured, the initial wave of horrified adrenaline receded, leaving behind an icy, crystalline calm. There would be no immediate confrontation, no screaming matches. My revenge would not be a crime of passion, it would be a carefully executed masterpiece of justice. Their accusation was that she's not thinking clearly. Very well, I decided, I would give them exactly what they expected, using their own words as the script for my performance. The week that followed was a tense game of cat and mouse, played out within the sun-drenched, silent rooms of my own home. I began my performance with small, deliberate errors. On Monday, when Chloe came by, I misplaced my reading glasses, patting my pockets with a look of theatrical frustration until she found them for me, perched on top of my head. She exchanged a look with Leo that was a sickening blend of pity and triumph. "Oh, Mom," Leo said, shaking his head, "we really need to get you organized." On Wednesday, I forgot a lunch appointment I'd supposedly made with a friend. Chloe, ever the helpful daughter-in-law, took it upon herself to call my friend, her voice dripping with concern as she explained my recent memory lapses and rescheduled on my behalf. I listened from the other room, marveling at her seamless ability to lie, to weave a narrative of my decline with such practiced ease. The centerpiece of my performance came on Friday. I knew they were planning to visit in the afternoon. Before they arrived, I went into the kitchen and turned the knob on one of the gas burners, just enough for the faint hiss of gas to be audible. But I did not light it. Then I went to the living room and pretended to have dozed off in my armchair. They let themselves in, their voices unnaturally cheerful. "Eleanor, we're here," Chloe called out. A moment later, a sharp, theatrical gasp. "Leo, do you smell that? It's gas." She rushed into the kitchen, making a great show of turning off the burner and flinging open the windows. She came back to the living room, her hand pressed to her chest, her face a perfect mask of horror. "Eleanor, you left the stove on. You could have killed us all," she cried, shaking me awake. I blinked, feigning disorientation. "The stove? Oh dear, I must have been making tea and I forgot." Leo looked at me, his expression now one of genuine, if manipulated, alarm. "Mom, this is serious," he said, his voice firm. "This proves you can't be left alone." They believed they had their smoking gun, the undeniable proof of my incompetence. The true mini payoff, however, was a financial one. Later that afternoon, feigning confusion over an online bill, I reluctantly allowed Leo to help me with my online banking. I sat beside him as he logged into my primary checking account, the one Richard and I had used for decades. He saw a balance that was respectable, but not extravagant. Enough to live on, but certainly not the vast fortune he was imagining. He helped me pay the electric bill, a look of smug control on his face. What he didn't know was that 2 days prior, I had made a quiet visit to a different bank, and with a single wire transfer, had moved the entirety of Richard's multi-million-dollar investment portfolio into a new, secure trust account that he would never find. He thought he was taking control of the kingdom, not realizing he was merely playing with the keys to the gatehouse. That evening, Chloe called, her voice now completely devoid of any pretense of asking for permission. It was the voice of someone who believed they were already in charge. "Don't you worry about a thing, Eleanor," she said, her tone dripping with condescending pity. "Leo and I will handle everything from now on." I clutched the phone, letting a faint, trembling whisper escape my lips, a final, perfect note in my performance. "That's wonderful, dear," I whispered, my voice trembling for effect. "I'm so lucky to have you." As I hung up, the facade dropped. My face was a mask of cold fury. I picked up the phone again, my hand perfectly steady, and made a much more important call. My next 2 phone calls were to the only people my husband had trusted more than me, a retired judge and our family doctor of 40 years. After ending the call with Chloe, the feigned weakness fell away from me like a snake, shedding its skin. My home was no longer a stage for my performance as a victim. It had become a war room. The first person I called was Judge Catherine Riley, Kate to her friends, a woman whose friendship with Richard and me stretched back decades. I remembered Richard once saying, after a particularly grueling case she had presided over, "Kate Riley has more integrity in her little finger than the entire state bar." It was that integrity I was now counting on. I met her that afternoon in her quiet, book-lined study. The mood was one of strategic planning and quiet determination. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I simply placed my phone on her desk, took a deep breath, and played the recording. Kate listened, her face impassive at first, then slowly hardening into a mask of cold, controlled fury. When the recording finished, she was silent for a long moment, her sharp legal mind dissecting every whispered word. "The little monsters," she said finally, her voice a low growl. "This isn't just greed, Eleanor. This is conspiracy to commit a felony, kidnapping, fraud, elder abuse. The list is long." She looked at me, her eyes sharp. "A private confrontation is useless. They'll deny it, destroy your phone, and accelerate their plans. We have to build an ironclad public trap." That was the first, glorious mini payoff of my new war, the validation and strategic mind of a powerful ally. Kate immediately began to provide the kind of clear, legal advice I so desperately needed. She outlined a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying, a high-stakes performance that would require all my strength. My next stop was the office of Dr. Martin, our family doctor for as long as I could remember. He was a loyal and concerned old friend who had held my hand when Richard was first diagnosed. I explained the situation, the pressure from my children, and their attempts to paint me as mentally incompetent. His kind face grew grave. "That's malpractice, Eleanor," he said, his voice firm, "and it's a damned lie." He then proceeded to give me the most thorough physical and cognitive exam of my life. He tested my memory, my reflexes, my reasoning. At the end of the 2-hour examination, he sat back, a sad but resolute look on his face. "Eleanor," he said, "you are in perfect physical and mental health for a woman of 68. In fact, your cognitive scores are sharper than most people 30 years younger." He printed out the results, a detailed multi-page report, and signed the final page with a flourish. "You file this away," he said, handing it to me. "This is your proof, the truth." Armed with Kate's legal strategy and Dr. Martin's medical validation, I took the final step. Guided by Kate, I contacted a trusted captain at the local police department, a man whose career Richard had quietly supported years ago. I explained the situation over a secure line, outlining the threat and the evidence I had. I told him about my plan to stage a medical emergency. He listened patiently, and when I was done, his response was immediate. "Just tell us when and where, Mrs. Hughes. We'll be there." That night, Kate called me one last time to go over the final details. Her voice was firm, a general giving final orders before a battle. "When you make the 911 call, Eleanor, you have to be convincing. Your voice, your words. They all have to be perfect. The 911 dispatch record is the first link in the evidence chain. We leave them no loopholes." With my allies in place and my evidence secure, there was only one thing left to do. It was time to schedule my accident. I chose the day with care, the Tuesday before they were scheduled to meet with their lawyer to finalize the guardianship papers. Theatrics, after all, are all about timing. With my allies in place and my evidence secure, the last few days had been an exercise in controlled calm, a quiet waiting game. I continued my performance as the fading widow, and I could see Leo and Chloe's confidence swelling with every forgotten name and misplaced item. They thought my spirit was broken. They had no idea it had been forged into steel. That Tuesday morning, I stood at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase of my home. The morning sun streamed through the high palladium window, illuminating the polished wood of the banister and the rich colors of the heavy Persian rug at the bottom. I looked down at that rug, the exact spot where Leo had fallen and scraped his knee as a 7-year-old boy. I remembered how I had rushed to him, how I had cleaned the wound and kissed it better, his childish sobs turning to hiccups in my arms. It seemed a fitting stage for my final performance, a place of past love and present betrayal. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I took a deep, shuddering breath, a genuine tremor of fear and adrenaline that I channeled into my role. Then I made the first call. I dialed Chloe's number, my voice weak and disoriented when she answered. "Chloe, dear," I began. My words slurred just enough to be convincing. I think I've fallen. I'm at the bottom of the stairs. My head, I can't seem to get up." "Eleanor? What are you talking about?" Her voice was sharp with irritation before it quickly shifted into a mask of practiced concern. "Oh my God, are you all right? Stay right there, I'm on my way." Before she could respond further, I let the phone clatter from my hand onto the hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the silent foyer. Then, I let out a low, convincing moan of pain, a sound I dredged up from the memory of Richard's last days. It was a sound of true suffering. And it was the truest thing I had offered them in weeks. My next action was the most critical. I crawled a few feet to where I had placed my other, older cell phone, the one they didn't know about. As Kate had instructed, I dialed 911. My voice was a trembling, panicked whisper, the perfect performance of an elderly woman, injured and alone. "I've fallen," I cried to the dispatcher. "Down the stairs. My head. I think I hit my head. I live alone. Please hurry." The dispatcher's calm, professional voice was a strange counterpoint to my feigned hysteria. An ambulance was on its way. The wait was agonizing. Every second stretched into an eternity. I lay there on the cold floor, my body carefully positioned, my head resting at an awkward angle, rehearsing the story of my dizziness and confusion. The sound of sirens in the distance was my cue. A few moments later, the paramedics were breaking down my front door, just as I knew they would have to. Chloe arrived at the exact same moment, her car screeching to a halt in the driveway. She ran in, her face a perfect mask of worried concern. But as the paramedics were loading me onto a stretcher, our eyes met, and in that fleeting second, I saw it. Not pity, not fear, but a cold, unmistakable flash of victory in her eyes. She thought she had won. "We're going to the hospital," the lead paramedic said, his voice a calm authority in the chaos. "We've notified your son." As they wheeled me out of the home I was fighting for, I closed my eyes, the world outside fading to black. The trap was sprung. Now I just had to wait for the rats to arrive. The hospital room was sterile and white, a blank canvas upon which the final ugly scene of my family's drama was about to be painted. The rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor beside my bed was the only sound, a metronome counting down the final moments before the confrontation. I lay perfectly still under the starched white sheets, feigning a groggy weakness, my mind sharp and alert. Every nerve in my body was thrumming with a mixture of fear and a cold, electrifying resolve. A compassionate-looking nurse with kind eyes came in to check my vitals. She wrapped the cuff around my arm, her touch gentle. "It's a little high, dear," she said softly as the machine whirred, "but that's to be expected after a nasty fall." I gave her a weak smile and thought, "You have no idea. My calm exterior was a lie, but it was the most necessary lie I had ever told." Soon after, the doctor, a serious-faced man in his 50s, came in to examine me. I continued my performance, complaining of a throbbing headache, dizziness, and a frustrating inability to remember the moments leading up to my fall. He shone a light in my eyes and asked me a series of questions I answered with deliberate, convincing hesitation. "Well, Mrs. Hughes," he said finally, "your scans don't show any serious trauma, but given your age and the reported memory loss, I'd like to keep you here for observation for at least 24 hours. It was the perfect medically plausible outcome Kate and I had hoped for. He had just finished speaking when Leo and Chloe appeared in the doorway. "Doctor, is she all right?" Chloe asked, rushing forward, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of a frantic, loving daughter-in-law. "She's stable," the doctor replied, "but we're keeping her for observation." I watched as they spoke to him in the hallway just outside my room, their voices low but audible. They were weaving their web, explaining that this was the very episode they had been worried about, that my confusion had been escalating for weeks. They were laying the groundwork for their lawyer, building their case for my incompetence with the unwitting validation of a medical professional. The doctor listened with a concerned professional sympathy, and I felt a pang of guilt for deceiving him, but it was a necessary casualty in this war. Finally, They entered the room and approached my bedside. Their faces were a sickening blend of performative pity and barely concealed triumph. They believed their plan had worked perfectly. They thought I was a helpless, injured old woman, a problem that had conveniently delivered itself into their hands. "Oh, Mom," Leo said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "We were so worried. You gave us such a scare." Chloe took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, her touch cold. "Don't you worry about anything, Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with a false, cloying kindness that turned my stomach. "We're here now. We'll take care of everything. In fact, the lawyer is on his way with the final papers. We can get it all signed and taken care of while you're here, so you'll have nothing to worry about when you get out." The audacity of it, the sheer naked greed of it, almost made me gasp. They were going to have me sign away my life while I was lying in a hospital bed, a captive audience to their final act of betrayal. I looked up at her, my eyes wide and pleading, the perfect picture of a woman at the end of her rope. "Yes," I whispered, my voice weak and raspy. "I know you will." As she smiled, a triumphant, predatory gleam in her eyes, my hand slowly moved to the small remote on my bedside table, the one connected to the discreet Bluetooth speaker I'd tucked into my handbag. My thumb hovered over the play button. They thought they were standing at my bedside to witness my surrender. They had no idea they were attending their own execution. As Chloe's triumphant words about the lawyer and the final papers hung in the sterile air, I looked at them. Truly looked at them, for what felt like the first time. I saw my son, Leo, looking out the window with a feigned air of concern, the son I had taught to ride a bike and bait a fishing hook, and I saw his wife, Chloe, her face a perfect mask of loving pity, the woman who had shared my dinner table and called me Mom. A wave of profound, soul-deep sadness washed over me for what they had become, but it was followed by a current of icy resolve. "Before you call your lawyer," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, completely devoid of the weakness I had been performing for weeks. "There's something you should hear." The shift in my tone was so abrupt it was like a physical blow. Chloe's condescending smile froze on her face, faltering. Leo, startled, snapped his head back toward me, his eyes wide with a confusion that was quickly turning to alarm. The compassionate-looking nurse, who had been quietly checking my IV drip, paused, her brow furrowing at the sudden change in the room's dynamics. The doctor, who had been reviewing my chart by the door, looked up, his expression one of professional curiosity. The stage was set. My audience was captive. I lifted the small black remote from my bedside table, my movement slow and deliberate. "I believe this concerns you both." I pressed the play button. After a moment of charged silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, their own voices, low, venomous, and perfectly captured, filled the quiet hospital room. "The lawyer said the wandering angle is the strongest," Chloe's recorded voice hissed, a serpent's whisper that seemed to physically suck the air from the room. I watched her face as she heard her own treachery. Her smile didn't just freeze, it shattered. Her hand, which had been resting on the bed rail, flew to her throat. The doctor's professional curiosity sharpened into focused disbelief. How would we even do that? Leo's weak, anxious voice followed, a pathetic echo of a man without a conscience. I saw my son flinch as if he'd been struck. He took an involuntary step back, his eyes darting towards the door like a cornered animal seeking escape. "We hire someone, a professional," Chloe's voice continued, cold and practical. "They pick her up, drive her out to the middle of nowhere, and drop her off. We call the police, frantic with worry. It's perfect." The doctor froze completely, his pen hovering over my chart. His head snapped up, and he stared at Leo and Chloe, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. The nurse's hand flew to her mouth, her quiet gasp audible in the sudden, thick silence between the recorded words. The color drained from Leo and Chloe's faces. They looked as if they had seen a ghost, the ghost of their own monstrous intentions, now given voice. The recording continued, an unrelenting testament to their depravity. Then came the final soul-destroying lines, Chloe's voice filled with a chilling, triumphant certainty. "It's foolproof, Leo. They find her disoriented miles from home. The doctors declare her a danger to herself. And we get control before she can fight back. It's clean." As the last damning word echoed and faded into a horrified silence, the door to the hospital room swung open. 2 uniformed police officers, led by the stern-faced captain I had spoken with, stepped inside. They didn't look at me or the bewildered medical staff. Their gaze was fixed, hard and unwavering, on my son and his wife. The captain's voice was calm but absolute, cutting through the thick, panicked atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. "Leo and Chloe Hughes, I believe you have a statement to make regarding a conspiracy to commit kidnapping." Chloe let out a strangled sob, a sound of pure animal terror, and collapsed into a nearby visitor's chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling into dust around her. Leo just stood there, speechless, his face a mask of utter devastation, as one of the officers stepped forward and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the silent room. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard, and in that moment it was the sound of my own freedom. The chaos in the hospital room swirled around me, but from the center of the storm I felt a strange, profound calm. The doctor and nurse, their faces pale with shock, were giving hushed, frantic statements to one of the officers. Leo, his face a hollow mask of disbelief, was led out without a word. Chloe, on the other hand, had dissolved into hysterical, screaming denials, her carefully constructed facade shattering into a million ugly pieces as a female officer firmly escorted her away. The war was over, and now the fallout was just beginning. After they were gone, the police captain, a man named Davies, approached my bed with a gentle, respectful demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the ugliness I had just witnessed. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, his voice low, "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to take your official statement now while everything is fresh in your mind." I sat up, the feigned weakness of the past weeks falling away completely. I felt a bone-deep exhaustion, but beneath it, a powerful sense of vindication was taking hold. I took a folder from my handbag, the one containing all my evidence, and handed it to him. On top, I had placed the clean medical report Dr. Martin had provided just a day before. My illness was a fiction, but their downfall was now a very real, documented fact. "Everything you need is in there, Captain," I said, my voice steady. The original recording, financial documents showing my son's debts, and a full report from my family doctor confirming my perfect mental and physical health. I recounted the events of the past few months calmly and methodically, my mind a steel trap of dates, times, and exact conversations. I was no longer a victim pleading her case. I was the state's primary witness, building an ironclad case against the people who had tried to erase me. An hour later, as the police were finishing their work, Judge Kate Riley arrived, sweeping into the hospital room like a force of nature. She took one look at my exhausted face, dismissed the hovering officers with a commanding nod, and pulled a chair up to my bedside. She took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You did it, Eleanor," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and profound sorrow. "You did the hardest thing a mother could ever have to do, and you did it with grace." Her presence was a balm to my frayed nerves. She was my advocate, my friend, ensuring that even in the chaotic aftermath, my rights and my dignity were protected. While we were speaking, I could hear the buzz of activity in the hallway. News travels fast in a hospital. A nurse bustled in, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "Mrs. Hughes, There's a reporter from the Charleston Post in the lobby asking for you. He said something about the arrest of a prominent family's son." Kate handled it with the swift cutting authority of a seasoned judge. "You will tell him that Mrs. Hughes has no comment, and that if he harasses my client in her hospital room, I will personally see to it that he is cited for contempt of court," she told the nurse, who scurried away, sufficiently intimidated. The climax of the day, however, came when Captain Davies returned to my room, his expression grim. "They're at the station," he informed me, flipping through his notepad. "And it's just as you'd expect. They're blaming each other, Mrs. Hughes. Your daughter-in-law is claiming she was coerced, that she was a victim of your son's desperate schemes and his fragile mental state. Your son is claiming he was manipulated by his wife, that she was the greedy mastermind behind it all. It's a mess." I listened, feeling not a shred of pity, only a profound, weary sadness. Their wicked alliance, so strong when they were plotting my demise, had crumbled into pathetic, desperate self-preservation at the first sign of real consequences. "Let them tear each other apart," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "They've already torn this family apart." I looked at the doctor, who had been quietly observing the proceedings from the corner of the room. "I believe I am well enough to be discharged," I said. He nodded quickly, relieved to have this chaotic chapter end. As he handed me the release forms, I signed my name with a steady, resolute hand, ready to go home for the first time as a truly free woman. A year later, the only whispers in my house were the rustling of leaves in the garden and the turning of pages in a good book. The heavy, oppressive silence of grief and betrayal had been replaced by a quiet, intentional peace that I had cultivated with the same care as my late husband's roses. The house was no longer a battlefield or a crime scene. It was a sanctuary once more, but this time it was a sanctuary I had defended, reclaimed, and redefined entirely on my own terms. The trial had been a painful but necessary ordeal, a public airing of a private sickness. The recording of their plot, played in the cold, silent courtroom, had been undeniable. The testimonies from the doctor and nurse at the hospital painted a vivid picture of their calculated cruelty. In the end, the jury's guilty verdict was swift. Leo and Chloe were convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, fraud, and attempted elder abuse. Their faces, when the sentences were read, were not masks of remorse but of stunned disbelief that their foolproof plan had resulted in lengthy prison terms. Their public disgrace was absolute, their names becoming a local cautionary tale whispered at Charleston dinner parties. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, my gaze would fall upon the photo of Richard and me on our 45th anniversary, the one that sat on the mantelpiece. For a long time, the memory of that day was tainted, inextricably linked to the ambush that followed. But now I could see it again for what it was, a picture of a man I had loved for a lifetime, a testament to a bond that their greed could tarnish but never truly break. I had reclaimed that memory, just as I had reclaimed my home. My new purpose had taken root in the ashes of my old life. A few months after the verdict, I sat in a sleek downtown office with my financial advisor and Judge Kate Riley, who had become my steadfast friend and confidant. On the polished table between us were the documents that would reshape Richard's legacy. With a steady hand, I signed the papers that formally established the Richard Hughes Foundation for Elder Justice. With the stroke of a pen, I redirected the entirety of our family's fortune, not to the son who had betrayed it, but to a cause that would honor his true spirit of protection and integrity. The foundation would provide pro bono legal aid, temporary housing, and psychological support for elderly people who were victims of family abuse. In a separate final document, I legally and permanently disinherited Leo and his entire bloodline, a firewall Richard would have approved of. It was not an act of anger, but one of absolute necessary consequence. The final scene of this long, painful drama unfolded on a cool autumn afternoon, a year to the day of their arrest. I was in the garden with Kate, a comfortable silence between us as we watched the sun dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The mail had arrived, and with it, a letter on stiff, prison-stamped stationery. I recognized Leo's looping, immature handwriting instantly. Kate saw my expression and asked gently, "Are you going to read it?" I held the letter for a long moment, the paper a flimsy artifact from a life that no longer felt like mine. My heart did not pound. It was still. I opened it, my hands steady. The first line was all I needed to see. "Dear Mom, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm writing to ask for your forgiveness." Without reading any further, I stood up and walked calmly to the outdoor fireplace where a small, cheerful fire was crackling against the evening chill. Kate watched me, saying nothing, her expression one of complete understanding. I looked down at the letter one last time, at the desperate plea from a son I no longer knew, a stranger who had once shared my home, and I felt nothing, not anger, not sadness, not even a flicker of pity. Only a quiet finality. I tossed the letter into the flames. We both watched the paper curl, the words of a false, too-late repentance turning black at the edges before disappearing into ash. I turned back to my friend, a small, peaceful smile on my face, the warmth of the fire on my back and the light of a new future ahead of me, finally and completely free of the past. They thought they were standing at my bedside to witness my surrender. They had no idea they were attending their own execution. As Chloe's triumphant words about the lawyer and the final papers hung in the sterile air, I met her gaze, my own eyes no longer feigning confusion, but filled with a cold, hard clarity that must have been jarring. The truth, I thought, recalling her whispered words on the recording, was about to be a very messy affair. The beep of the heart monitor beside me felt like a timer, counting down the seconds to their destruction. "Before you call your lawyer," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, completely devoid of the weakness I had been performing for weeks, "there's something you should hear." The shift in my tone was so abrupt, it was like a physical blow. Chloe's condescending smile froze on her face, faltering. Leo, who had been looking out the window with an air of bored entitlement, snapped his head back toward me, his eyes wide with a confusion that was quickly turning to alarm. The compassionate-looking nurse, who had been quietly checking the saline levels in my IV drip, paused her work, her brow furrowing at the sudden change in the room's dynamics. The doctor, who had been reviewing my chart by the door, looked up, his expression one of professional curiosity. The stage was set. My audience was captive. I lifted the small black remote from my bedside table, my movements slow and deliberate. "I believe this concerns you both." I pressed the play button. After a moment of charged silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, their own voices, low, venomous, and perfectly captured, filled the quiet hospital room. "The lawyer said the wandering angle is the strongest," Chloe's recorded voice hissed, a serpent's whisper that seemed to physically suck the air from the room. I watched her face as she heard her own treachery. Her smile didn't just freeze, it shattered. Her hand, which had been resting on the bed rail, flew to her throat. The doctor's professional curiosity sharpened into focused disbelief. How would we even do that? Leo's weak, anxious voice followed, a pathetic echo of a man without a conscience. I saw my son flinch as if he'd been struck. He took an involuntary step back, his eyes darting towards the door like a cornered animal seeking escape. "We hire someone, a professional," Chloe's voice continued, cold and practical. "They pick her up, drive her out to the middle of nowhere, and drop her off. We call the police, frantic with worry. It's perfect." The doctor froze completely, his pen hovering over my chart. His head snapped up and he stared at Leo and Chloe, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. The nurse's hand flew to her mouth. her quiet gasp audible in the sudden thick silence between the recorded words. The color drained from Leo and Chloe's faces. They looked as if they had seen a ghost, the ghost of their own monstrous intentions, now given voice. The recording continued, an unrelenting testament to their depravity. Then came the final, soul-destroying lines, Chloe's voice filled with a chilling, triumphant certainty. "It's foolproof, Leo. They find her disoriented miles from home. The doctors declare her a danger to herself, and we get control before she can fight back. It's clean." As the last damning word echoed and faded into a horrified silence, the door to the hospital room swung open. 2 uniformed police officers, led by the stern-faced captain I had spoken with, stepped inside. They didn't look at me or the bewildered medical staff. Their gaze was fixed, hard and unwavering, on my son and his wife. The captain's voice was calm, but absolute, cutting through the thick, panicked atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. "Leo and Chloe Hughes, we've received a report regarding a conspiracy to commit kidnapping. We need you to come with us." Chloe let out a strangled sob, a sound of pure animal terror, and collapsed into a nearby visitor's chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling into dust around her. Leo just stood there, speechless, his face a mask of utter devastation, as one of the officers stepped forward and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the silent room. The only sound in the room was the sharp metallic click of handcuffs closing around my son's wrists, a sound that cut through the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. It was a sound of absolute finality, a sound that was both the end of my family as I knew it and the beginning of a harsh, undeniable justice. The sterile white room, which moments ago had been their stage for one final act of deception, now felt like a cage, and the bars were closing in. As the reality of her situation finally penetrated Chloe's panicked mind, her catatonic shock shattered, replaced by a wild, hysterical fury. She lunged to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of vicious denial, her manicured nails digging into her own arms. "This is a lie!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the small room, turning the heads of the curious hospital staff, now crowding the doorway. "She's a senile old woman. She faked it. Doctor, tell them she fell, that she's mentally unstable. She set us up." She pointed a trembling finger at me, her eyes wild, searching for any foothold in her collapsing reality. The police captain remained implacable, his expression a mask of professional duty, unmoved by her theatrics. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a calm, unyielding wall of authority that cut through her hysteria. "Regarding her fall, we have 2 credible professional witnesses, a doctor and a nurse, who observed the events. Regarding her mental state, we have a full medical report confirming her excellent health, and regarding the setup, we have a full audio recording of your conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise it." His words, so grounded in fact, seemed to only fuel her rage. As the female officer gently but firmly took her arm, Chloe turned her venom on the only person left to blame. She faced my son, who stood there, utterly broken and defeated, his shoulders slumped in the ill-fitting hospital gown. "This is all your fault," she screamed, her voice raw with a hatred that was terrifying to behold. "You were too weak. You couldn't even handle your own mother. You promised me everything, and you ruined it all." I watched it all unfold from my bed, a pillar of quiet strength amidst the chaos. I thought of Judge Kate Riley's advice from weeks ago, her calm, steady voice in her study. "Let the law handle it, Eleanor. Its gears grind slowly, but they grind fine." I finally understood what she meant. This ugly public unraveling, this pathetic torrent of blame, was the fine grinding of the gears of justice. The walk down the hospital corridor was their public shaming. Chloe, still sobbing and screaming, was a pitiful, undignified spectacle, a stark contrast to the elegant, controlled woman who had tried to destroy me. But Leo was silent. Just before he was guided through the doorway, past the sea of staring, whispering faces, he stopped and turned, looking at me one last time. His eyes, once so full of a weak, resentful entitlement, were now filled with nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. It was the look of a man who understood, in that single devastating moment, that he had not only lost a fortune, but his father's legacy, his honor, his family, and his own soul. He said nothing as they led him away. A tense, heavy silence fell over the room after they were gone. The doctor, his face pale with shock, finally turned to me. He picked up my chart, his hands shaking slightly, and looked at the report from Dr. Martin that I had provided to the police. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, his voice filled with a new, profound respect. "Your medical chart says you're in perfect health. It seems you can be discharged whenever you're ready." I walked out of the hospital into the bright Charleston sun, not as a patient, but as a survivor. The doctor's final words confirming my perfect health had been the official closing statement on their campaign of lies. The war was over, but now, as the automatic doors slid shut behind me, I had to survey the battlefield of my life and decide what to rebuild from the ashes. Kate was waiting for me, her car idling at the curb, a silent, steady presence in the swirling chaos of my emotions. The ride home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled into my driveway, I remembered Richard's words, his voice a faint, encouraging echo in my mind. "You're stronger than they think." I had finally proven him right, but the victory felt heavy, tinged with the profound sorrow of what had been irrevocably lost. A few days later, I found myself in Kate's comfortable, sunlit study, a stark contrast to the cold hostility of hospital rooms and my own besieged home. The air smelled of old leather and brewing tea, an atmosphere of somber reflection and strategic planning. I was exhausted, the adrenaline of the past weeks having finally given way to a profound, bone-deep weariness. But beneath the exhaustion, I felt a new, resolute strength taking root. Kate, ever the pragmatist, got straight to the point, laying out a series of legal documents on her polished desk. "I spoke with the district attorney's office this morning," she began, her voice even and serious. "They're facing serious felony charges, Eleanor. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping, wire fraud, attempted elder abuse. The evidence is overwhelming, especially with the testimony from the doctor and nurse. Bail was denied." She paused, her gaze steady. "Their new, high-priced lawyer is already trying to float a temporary insanity plea for Chloe, claiming Leo manipulated and coerced her. Leo's counsel, in turn, is painting him as a desperate man, unduly influenced by a sociopathic wife. They've already turned on each other." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. "Of course," I said. "The performance never ends." "It won't work," Kate assured me. "Not with the recording, but this is just the beginning. Now we need to secure the estate. We need to move quickly." We spent the next hour discussing the legal path forward. She advised me on the immediate steps I needed to take, freezing the joint accounts Richard and I had shared, accounts Leo might still have had access to, and, most importantly, the process of formally restructuring the family trust to remove Leo as a primary beneficiary. It was a cold, clinical conversation about severing the legal and financial ties to my only son, about dismantling the future Richard had once envisioned. It was in that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by Kate's law books and a lifetime of wisdom, that I made the most important decision of my new life. The fortune that had nearly cost me my life, the money that had corrupted my son and turned his wife into a monster, could not be a source of comfort for me. It had to become a source of strength for others. "I know what I want to do," I said, a clarity I hadn't felt in years settling over me. "I want to create a foundation in Richard's name." Kate looked at me, a slow, proud smile spreading across her face. "Go on." "They wanted the inheritance," I said, the climax of my decision ringing with a quiet, powerful finality. They can have it, but not a single dollar will go to them. It will go to protecting other elderly people from children like mine. A week later, Kate's lawyer had prepared all the necessary documents. I sat at my own dining room table, the same table where they had ambushed me with their power of attorney papers, and now I held all the power in my own hands. The documents were thick and final, a legal fortress around my future. As I held the heavy black pen to sign my son out of my life forever, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized with a sinking heart. My sister-in-law, Carol, Leo's aunt. I let it ring, but she was persistent. Finally, I answered. "Eleanor, please don't hang up," she began, her voice a frantic, tearful torrent. "I just got off the phone with Leo's lawyer. They're ruined. You can't do this, Eleanor. He's your son. You can't just throw him away. Please, for the good of the family, you have to reconsider." I listened to her desperate plea, to the familiar refrain of family that had once been used as a shield for their abuse. "Carol," I said, my voice calm and steady, "the good of the family ended the moment they plotted to have me kidnapped. I am doing this because he is my son, and this is the last, hardest lesson he will ever learn." I ended the call, my hand steady. I looked down at the documents, at the line waiting for my signature, and I signed my name. A year later, the only letters I received from my son came on stiff prison stamp stationery, and they went straight from the mailbox into the fireplace. In the wake of my final, resolute decision to sign him out of my life, a profound quiet had settled over my home. It was not the silence of grief, but the peaceful, intentional silence of a life reclaimed. The frantic phone call from my sister-in-law had been the last dying gasp of the old family dynamic, a final, futile attempt to pull me back into a world of obligation and guilt. I had simply hung up, and with that small, quiet act, I had chosen my future. The trial itself had been a somber but validating affair. The recording was the centerpiece, an undeniable testament to their cold-hearted conspiracy. The testimonies of the doctor and nurse from the hospital, both professionally outraged at having been used as pawns, left no room for doubt. Leo and Chloe were found guilty on all counts. The judge, in her sentencing, spoke of a profound betrayal of filial trust and a chilling disregard for human dignity. They received lengthy prison sentences, their public disgrace as complete and as absolute as their private cruelty had been. Now, my days were filled not with anxiety and strategic maneuvering, but with purpose. I sat on the board of the Richard Hughes Foundation for Elder Justice, my new reality forged in the fires of my own ordeal. We had a small, dedicated staff, and our work was already making a difference. We provided pro bono legal counsel to seniors facing conservatorship battles, offered grants for home security systems, and ran a hotline for those who, like me, felt isolated and under attack from their own families. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I would look up at my husband's portrait, which hung over the mantelpiece. His painted eyes, once a source of painful memory, were now filled with a peace I had finally found for myself. I had honored him not by clinging to a broken version of our family, but by building something new and powerful in his name. I had turned their greed into a force for good. The final scene of this long, painful drama unfolded on a quiet, snowy evening, a year to the day of their sentencing. I was sitting by the fire, a cup of hot tea in my hands, watching the snow fall outside, each flake a soft, silent blessing on my peaceful home. The mail arrived, and with it another letter from the state penitentiary. I recognized Leo's looping, immature handwriting immediately. I held the letter for a long moment, the paper a flimsy artifact from a life that no longer felt like mine. There was no flicker of old pain, no surge of anger, no curiosity about the contents, I already knew what it would contain: more pleas for forgiveness, more self-pitying excuses, more attempts to rewrite a history that had been irrevocably sealed. My expression was calm and unreadable. I didn't open it. I didn't hesitate. I simply stood, walked the few steps to the fireplace, and tossed the letter into the flames. I watched the paper blacken at the edges, the words of a son I no longer knew curling into ash before disappearing completely. As the last of it vanished, I took a sip of my tea, my reflection in the dark window showing a woman who was not grieving, not angry, but finally, completely free. Watching my son's last letter turn to ash in the fireplace, I didn't feel anger or even sadness, just the quiet finality of a story that had truly ended. I learned that the greatest act of love is to respect yourself enough to set a boundary that can never be crossed, and that true justice isn't revenge, but the peace you reclaim. Now, the only warmth in my home is the one I create for myself. Have you ever had to draw a difficult line to protect your own peace? I would love to hear your story in the comments below.